Welcome to the African Pharmaceutical Review podcast, your go to source for the latest insights, trends, and discussions in the world of pharmaceuticals and biotechnology. My name is Bevin Likuyani, editor at African Pharmaceutical Review, and in each episode, we'll dive deep into the dynamic landscape of the pharmaceutical industry. Today, we have an exciting episode lined up for you, and it centers around local production of medical products in Africa. To say the topic divides opinion is an understatement. One faction believes that the key to unlocking growth and performance of the continent's pharmaceutical sector lies in developing self reliance through local manufacturing. Yet another faction argues that Africa lacks the adequate goodwill and market consolidation to make local production sustainable in the region. Here to help us unpack this topic is Ms. Kirti Narsai, a professional with vast experience and deep passion about both the pharmaceutical industry and Africa as a continent. Welcome, Kirti.
Thank you very much, Bevan, for giving me this opportunity to speak about a topic that I'm very passionate about.
So, for those who may be unfamiliar with you, could you please provide a brief introduction of who you are and the current role you play in the pharmaceutical sector?
So, I am South African. I am a qualified pharmacist like you. I've got about 26 years of experience in the pharmaceutical sector in Africa. I've spent many years in the private sector, and now I am an independent consultant for various organizations that have African interests.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Now we can dive deep into our discussion straight off the bat. In your opinion, do you believe that Africa should prioritize local production? And if so, why?
So, the short answer to that question is absolutely yes. And I think recent events happening around the world has shown us that we have fragile health systems. We are heavily reliant on pharmaceutical imports, even though we've had major policy initiatives like the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa and more recently the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. However, we're still very much dependent on imports. So the COVID pandemic comes to mind, where we realized how this import dependence can really impact public health negatively. And now, recently, also, we've seen a lot of supply chain disruptions because of global political shifts that also impacts on access to medicines and supply chain security of medicines across the continent. So those are two factors that come to mind immediately as to why we should be focusing on local manufacturing. But there are also other reasons, like developing the sector, creating jobs, improving intra African trade of pharmaceuticals, and also dealing with public health issues that are unique to the African continent. So, those are some areas that make a compelling case for local production in Africa.
You make some interesting points there, Kirti. And currently, as it stands, the truth is that we don't have an abundance of local manufacturers. In fact, as at 2019, we have less than 400 local manufacturers, majority of whom are domiciled in Northern Africa. So, in your view, what are the primary challenges facing local manufacturing of medical products in the continent?
You're absolutely right. And I think just looking at the statistics that you've mentioned, the one fundamental factor that we also have a problem with is getting accurate data. So, depending on what data you're looking at, they will say that there's 600 manufacturers across 8 countries, or like you mentioned, some other figures now. So, I think accurate data is also lacking as to what our manufacturing capabilities are. Also, what's the productivity levels of the manufacturing facilities that we already have? What type of capabilities do they have? Are they GMP approved? Are they WHO pre-qualified? So there's a lot of lack of data, and I think that makes it difficult for investors, for instance, to tap into that capacity. So that is one area. And then, of course, we've got varying regulatory regimes, which make it very difficult to move medicines across borders. So we know that there's been a lot of progress made in terms of operationalizing the African Medicines Agency, and this will definitely deal with the regulatory side of things, but we need to look at regulation right across the value chain. And when I say this, I mean, do our customs and border controls work? Do we have the necessary port health authorities in place that can keep, for instance, substandard and falsified medicines out of markets, but also at the same time facilitate cross-border trade of pharmaceuticals? You know, this will create substantial markets to create competitiveness for our local manufacturers. So those are some challenges. And then, of course, you know, the import of production inputs, that is a major factor. We have a lot of currency volatility, which impacts purchasing of production inputs from foreign sources because we don't have manufacturing capacity that is significant enough to make an impact on lowering the costs of local production. And then there's also the area of access to procurement mechanisms. So we have both local procurement mechanisms that make it difficult for local manufacturers to access them. And then when you look at other broader areas of public health like HIV, TB, etc., where there are global procurement mechanisms in place, local manufacturers find it difficult to access those procurement mechanisms because of meeting international standards, FDA approval requirements, etc. The other area that we need to look at that local manufacturers could find challenging is having an enabling environment. So when we talk about enabling environments, you know, it's everything from access to the necessary skills, equipment maintenance, basic infrastructure like water and electricity that's uninterrupted in terms of the supply, as well as favorable financing environments, so tax regimes, access to finance, etc. Those are some of the areas that have been highlighted that really make local manufacturing quite challenging.
And those are indeed significant challenges. And the thing is, when we're talking about local production of pharmaceutical products, particularly in Africa, another conversation that creeps in is the issue of sustainability. There have been very grave questions around sustainability of the whole approach. So, in your opinion, what are some of the strategies that can be implemented to ensure sustainability in the local production of pharmaceutical products within the region?
So, sustainability, you know, firstly, we need to make sure that we're all thinking the same thing when we talk about sustainability. We also talk about competitiveness. I think one of the areas that has been challenging is that countries that have focused on local manufacturing are all trying to do similar things. And so if we replicating the same capabilities or similar capabilities across markets, it will make it very difficult to be competitive in an environment like that. However, we have a new opportunity through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which really emphasizes the development of regional value chains and regional integration. And I think that there's an opportunity there to create sustainable pharmaceutical value chains with more than one country focusing on how they can contribute to the value chain. I think that we need to broaden our definition of what we mean when we talk about regional value chains and not only narrowly focus on just the production process, but also what kind of inputs and services do we need that will make the pharmaceutical value chain efficient as well as competitive. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there because even things like manufacturing equipment gets imported. If you have a maintenance issue, you need people from outside of the continent to come and address any maintenance issues on your production equipment. Like I mentioned earlier, we have to import most of the production inputs. So these are all areas where there's an opportunity to localize. And localize not only within one market, but if we're thinking about it from a regional integration point of view, then looking at partnering with neighboring countries to see how they can provide services and other inputs into the value chain. Even packaging is an opportunity.
Absolutely. And still on the same discussion in terms of inputs and importing the inputs, there's always been this question about the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which we know accounts for majority of the finished product in terms of cost. Do you think the continent also is ready or should be focusing on producing the active pharmaceutical ingredients and excipients within the region?
So, yeah, that's a very controversial point, right? And like you said, opinion on whether we should be doing this or not is divided. However, we do need to look at what is the current situation. The current situation is that APIs are imported. They also account for the majority of the production cost of pharmaceuticals. But over and above that, there's also tariffs on importing production inputs. And I think that's where we need to start is eliminating those tariffs to make them more accessible to local manufacturers and also having the knock-on impact of reducing the cost of production. However, when we look at APIs, we tend to think about only the end product, which is the API, and not necessarily looking at what are the intermediate compounds which also need to be manufactured. And I think there is an opportunity there for us to look at that. Also, keeping in mind our level of skills and capabilities to be able to produce APIs. But there is definitely a market for those intermediate compounds as well, which are at present dominated by the Asian markets. But we also need to consider how competitive we will be in the API space. There have been some studies done to look at what is the feasibility from a break even point of view of manufacturing APIs locally. And some of the studies indicate that it will take about 5 years to break even in terms of developing technology, starting up a new manufacturing facility, and then manufacturing, for instance, ARVs. However, like I said, there is an opportunity to look at the manufacturing of the intermediate compounds as well, and also to leapfrog this lag time to become competitive. There's also an opportunity to partner with international companies that have an interest in investing in Africa that already have the capabilities. So I read your article on contract manufacturing with great interest. And I think you make some excellent points about the opportunities of becoming competitive through these strategic partnerships. And we have seen some of these partnerships being announced in developing capabilities for COVID vaccine manufacturing. However, we need to look at more basic commodities that are needed for public health to see what are the opportunities that can really leapfrog African manufacturers into becoming competitive, not only on the African continent, but also globally.
Absolutely. You've mentioned partnerships, and the truth is that in most conversations that are usually held around local production of medical products in Africa, collaboration is always a recurring theme. So, in your opinion, how important is it for key stakeholders to collaborate both within the continent and also internationally for the success of local pharmaceutical productions in Africa?
I think it's absolutely imperative. We don't do well on collaborating with each other, which is also why our intra-African trade levels remain very low. But there's institutional issues that really prevent that kind of collaboration, and I think some of those are being addressed under the Continental Free Trade Agreement. But I think it also requires us to at least communicate. Even just in terms of sharing public health information, data, disease burden information, etc. I think, we need to start with the basics, and then also that will allow us to see what are the opportunities. But there's definitely a place for collaboration. And we are seeing more of that happening, with many of these announcements of strategic partnerships across the continent, with the mRNA hub that's been announced and is now fully operational in South Africa. There's definitely signs that these types of collaboration opportunities are being leveraged. We also see a lot more political will and leadership from Pan African institutions like the African Medicines Agency, the Free Trade Area Secretariat, the Africa CDC. So I think these are all positive signs that create a sound foundation for collaboration to flourish. And I'm hoping that many more private sector organizations will use these foundational elements as an opportunity to pursue not only public private partnerships, but also private private partnerships, like, for instance, with contract manufacturing.
Interesting. And finally, and earlier you mentioned about the African Continental Free Trade Area and other initiatives like the African Medicines Agency focusing on regulatory harmonization. When you consider all these initiatives that are being put in place in the continent, how do you envision the future of the African pharmaceutical sector?
Well, ch- to put it very briefly, I think the future is really bright. We haven't seen, I mean, like I mentioned in my introduction, I've been in this industry for over 26 years. And I think the momentum and the political will and the progress that we've seen in the last couple of years is unmatched. If you go back in the history of the development of the pharmaceutical sector, it already started in the 1930s. But we've lagged behind other markets like India, China, etc. But now we're seeing this resurgence of a real tangible momentum in developing the sector, and I think that that's extremely positive. But it also requires us to leverage the opportunities that are being created through these initiatives.
That indeed is a bright future, and it's the perfect place to wind up. Thank you so much, Kirti. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you,
Um,
Bevan, for
and
the opportunity.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning into the African Pharmaceutical Review. We truly hope you found today's discussion insightful. Remember, stay tuned for more updates and the latest updates in the pharmaceutical industry. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay pharma and stay informed.